screen today. I'm Melanie Weaver Barnett, the Executive Director of UNICON, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're gathering at a time when the world feels increasingly uncertain to most of us, and for some of us, maybe sometimes it's even a bit frightening. And we're experiencing so many changes in the environment. There's geopolitical conflict, there's rising nationalism, global alliances are shifting in some really significant ways. For depending on what country you're in, there are some serious constraints put on universities, in particular in the US, maybe in other parts of the world as well. And, there are all these similar kinds of effects on our clients too. So we're dealing with it in every direction we look. In fact, you might say that executive education sits at this, what you might call a fragile intersection of global business and academic freedom and human development. And in the midst of all of that, we have to think about strategy and policy and practices, management and leadership and operations. Every aspect of our work needs reconsideration. It's hard enough to lead when, things are just normally disruptive. There's always some kind of disruption in the marketplace, right? But by many accounts, this is really off the charts disruptive. So a lot of our attention as managers and leaders and employees of executive education gets focused on managing the finances. Let's rethink our strategy. What are we going to do about enrollments? And today we want to focus on something that is equally, or I would argue, more important than any of those things, and that is the people side, the human side of our work. And we recognize that depending on what part of the world you're in, these disruptions that are taking place may be affecting you in different ways. But as we talk with our members from 6 continents and 30 some countries, we have come to believe that almost no one is left untouched. And so that's why we set this webinar up for you. So we want to explore today, what does it mean to lead our teams with integrity? What does it mean to support our faculty members under pressure? How can we create a classroom environment where our participants feel like they belong, they're welcome, they're engaged, they're enthusiastic about learning, especially when all of these tensions and conflict may follow them right into our classrooms? And just as importantly, how do we take care of ourselves and our teams while we do all of this? So to explore these very important and pertinent questions, I am so grateful to have with us today 2 leading voices in this space. Professor Gretchen Spreitzer, who is the Associate Dean for Corporate and Executive Development at my alma mater and where I worked for many years, which is the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business. And we also have Gianpiero Petriglieri, who is an associate professor of organizational behavior who studies this very stuff we're talking about today. And he is from INSEAD. And he goes by GP. And even though I've only recently met him, gave me permission to refer to him as GP today. So that's what I'm going to do. So Gretchen and GP, thank you so much for joining us. The research that these 2 impressive faculty members have done, and their teaching and their writings, have really helped shape how we think about leadership and learning and humanity in organizations. And so we're going to really tap their knowledge today. So we'll spend around 30 minutes on questions that we've prepared for them. And we're going to give you time for Q&A. We're going to have a quick breakout group, give you a chance to speak with a few other colleagues about, what you've heard and what you think it means for executive education. And then we'll come back and we've got one more powerful question for each of them at the very end before we'll let you go on your way. And we will finish by 10 o'clock. All right. 10 o'clock Eastern time at the top of the hour. Let's say that. So we're going to start. I'd like to start with just an sort of overarching question about the overall landscape and its effect. So I'd like to ask for both Gretchen and GP to comment on what you're seeing in terms of the effects of this turbulent environment on business school staff and faculty. Let's focus on us at first. What are you seeing as the effects on business school staff and faculty? And if you are seeing any, variation in this by region or country, please comment on that. GP, do you want to start us off?
Yeah. I mean, you've said a lot of the context we're right we're dealing with, sort of the geopolitical. I think there's two big trends that certainly affect us on a daily basis. When one is a sort of technological disruption ongoing in business, and maybe accelerating perhaps. And the other one is the kind of very serious consequences of the geopolitical temper tantrums of leaders across the board. And that generates volatility. And I think the kind of long-term disruption in general, it's good for business, right? Because when there's uncertainty, companies want to invest in learning. And we should be in the business of helping people meet the uncertainty with more equanimity and with more knowledge and with more capacity. But volatility is a different matter because I think it does put pressure on both our professional colleagues and on us faculty, because things are changing every week. Programs that were scheduled to be delivered in a certain country, suddenly clients want to deliver them in another country because they're worried that people might not be able to travel one place or the other. Just 15 minutes before we got onto this call, I received an email where my school has issued a travel advisory in the Middle East, which is one of the regions where we see a lot of very exciting growth and interest in executive education. A few months ago, I never thought I would see a travel advisory to the US for faculty traveling there, which of course puts into question the kind of activities we have at INSEAD, which tend to be programmed with large organizations who do desire and to whom we do desire to offer programs in multiple locations so that people can also take advantage of working in a global environment, which is our signature offer. And so all that is happening. And you asked, what effect it has. I mean, volatility brings anxiety. Volatility brings anxiety. So although you might see, or certainly we're seeing a very healthy pipeline of work, lots of interest in teaching in AI, lots of interest in teaching geopolitics, leadership, lots of interest in people gathering together to think about the future of their company. The question is at what cost? Because certainly we are organized with the times of academia, which are relatively stable and slow, deep thinking, research, and we are not used to this kind of very quick changes that maybe other players like consulting firms are used to working with. And therefore, even servicing the demand and delivering the growth comes at both an economic and I would say the psychosocial cost. And one is certainly more anxiety, not just more uncertainty, because uncertainty is cognitive, but anxiety is emotional, and anxiety is the classic enemy of learning. Anxiety makes us feel, more cautious, certainly not more stuck. It doesn't make us open and generous. And the other thing that I think perhaps might be local, but I don't think so. I think lots of us who do executive education, certainly true at INSEAD, but I imagine that's not true only at INSEAD. We pride ourselves in creating spaces where differences can become creativity, can become growth, can become learning. And that is not just an economic project. That is a social project, a project of building connections that generate psychological, social, and economic value. And I must be honest, that project these days of bringing together differences in a creative way feels very fragile. Something that attracted me to this place, it feels we live in a world where that ideal, which I consider one of the most beautiful human idea, that the different is desirable. The difference is not something you want to ignore or fight or even tolerate, that you desire it for your own enrichment, for the benefits of others, I've never felt more fragile and imperiled. And so you use that word fragile intersection. And I think anyone who's in an intersection these days feel fragile. And dealing with that, of course, has its own toll and requires attention. And I guess that's why we're here.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And thank you for laying out that context. I know in my life, and I think it's probably true of everyone who's in this business, this idea of the globalness of our work is so enriching and invigorating and important to us. And it's becoming much more difficult to do that. So thank you. And that leads me to a bunch of follow-up questions, but I think we're going to address those as we do our questioning. But Gretchen, would you respond to that question as well?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, wonderful to see so many familiar faces online. It's good to be together. I think like GP, in difficult times, the humanity piece is just so important. And so being together makes such a big difference in how we cope and how we deal with um, the situation at hand. I ran across a term yesterday as I was putting some notes together for today, polycrisis, where you have more than one crisis at the same time that are interdependent with each other. So, Melanie, the economic, the geopolitical, the social piece that GP talked about, whether it's, the attack on DEI here, whether it's the immigration crisis we have in the world where people feel uncertain about their future, and then the whole environmental crisis that we're in. I'm sitting here in my office this morning as we have this heat dome here in the Midwest of the US and the East Coast, where it's, in June, unbelievably warm and humid, and my office isn't able to keep up with the heat outside. So if you see drips, coming down my face, we're just in a really different time. So this idea of polycrisis and the way that creates, as GP was talking about, the anxiety that creates. Change is changing, change is more unpredictable, and that leads to something we often refer to as threat rigidity. So in the face of substantial change, we see people more rigid in the face of change, whether that rigidity comes from a constriction of control, where leaders are more micromanaging, checking in on each other, taking away empowerment, wanting to be more part of everyday decision making. It leads to restriction in information processing. That anxiety makes it harder for people to think outside the box in different ways. And we see a reliance on past learned behaviors. So going back to the basics. And that threat rigidity can lead to higher levels of allostatic load, where that anxiety, rather than being episodic or acute, becomes more chronic. And over time, we know that has bodily, physiological effects on people too, dealing with that long-term stress, whether it's high blood pressure or poor relationships with family, or stopping doing things like exercise that we know is so important for people's well-being. Just building on what GP was talking about, we're in kind of uncharted territory, and where we might see people pulling in to protect themselves at the very time that we need leadership, we need innovation, we need people thinking outside the box. So I go back to Winston Churchill's famous quote, never let a good crisis go to waste. So how can we take these difficult times and use them as an opportunity for innovation or doing things differently, thinking differently?
Thank you so much for that. I think oftentimes in these kinds of crises or difficult challenges, there are opportunities, and it's sometimes struggles to find them, especially when people are more anxious and people are more rigid and so on. It becomes even more difficult to be creative and innovative. So I kind of want to combine, I think, the next two questions that we talked about, Gretchen and GP, where what does it mean then? And let's focus on ourselves now. I know we've got our clients and the world, society, and so on, but let's just focus on our executive education teams now. And everything we talk about also has application to clients and so on, but I'd like to focus on us. What is a thriving culture now, like in this time of uncertainty and disruption? What is it? How can we create a thriving culture, a culture in which people thrive? And if you have thoughts about organizational structures or practices or whatever that support human thriving, even when the external conditions are making things are very volatile and maybe even dehumanizing sometimes and making us more, as you both said, more rigid, more anxious. So what do we do inside our organizations to help with this? Gretchen, you want to start?
Sure. So I've been studying what it means to thrive in work settings for more than a decade now. And one thing that we know is that when people are thriving, they're experiencing high levels of learning and high levels of vitality. So they're feeling energized at the same time that they're learning, growing, getting better, learning from their experiences. And so, thriving isn't just feeling good. It's not just getting better. It's that juxtaposition of those two things together. And so, what does that mean? How do we, even in difficult times, find ways to move ourselves and our people more into a thriving mode? There's three, what we found in the research and practice is there's three most important levers for increasing our own thriving and the thriving of our people. One is about purpose and meaning. So the more that we can give ourselves some injections or a booster shot of purpose of why what we're doing matters, why it's making a difference to other people. So it might be asking for feedback. It might be looking for areas of contribution. Like I'm seeing examples in my own work organization where people are sharing, we got this feedback from a client and this is what they said, how it was really helpful to us. And we share those with the larger organization because those kind of booster shots of purpose help us elevate and make us recognize that what we're doing matters. So that's one, helping people look for those booster shots of purpose. I think another way is going to conferences and learning new things and seeing the way that we're doing is really mattering to people. So that's one. A second one is building stronger relationships. Work environments where we're building trust, where we're showing respect for each other. My colleague Jane Dutton does a lot of work on high quality connections. Like how are we connecting with each other? It's easy when we're anxious to lash out or show anger, but how do we purposefully look for opportunities to build more of that trust, to show gratitude? Maybe it's the handwritten thank you note. If you could see behind my screen, you would see all these little notes that people have given me at various points in time. And I put them up to help me have that sense of like that the little things do matter and that people do care. Small gatherings can make a big difference. Yesterday afternoon, our dean, Sharon Matusik, had a group of staff over to her home for a happy hour. So it was the IT staff, it was the one group I manage, our action-based learning group, and then it was our global initiatives group. So groups we don't normally interact with, we got together on her patio, and it was, just a really nice time to make some connections with each other. Okay, so purpose and meaning, one, relationships, two, third, positive emotions. So as we talked about before, the more people feel anxious or angry, they either pull in to protect themselves or they lash out or try to move away from the threat. When people experience more positive emotions, Barbara Fredrickson's work suggests that people can broaden and build because of those positive emotions. They can see things they couldn't see otherwise, and they're able to pull things together in a way that they couldn't see before. So experiencing more positive emotions also can help build more of a thriving culture. So my daughters talk about the Sunday scaries. How do we transform the start of the work week into something more positive? Often when I'm teaching or working with executive groups or starting off a meeting, we'll do something called 30-second celebrations, a chance to go around the table and have everybody share something they're excited about, maybe that happened over the weekend or something that they're looking forward to. It can be something very personal. It could be something more professional, something big or small, but that 30-second celebration, I guess, helps build relationships, but it also inject some positive energy at the beginning of a meeting. We have our leadership team gets a monthly meeting this afternoon, and we'll start out. We don't call them 30-second celebrations there. We call them good news, but it's the same ideas. When I had an earlier dean who was very competitive, he called them victories or wins. You have to translate it, for your culture, but 30-second celebrations gives people permission to share things that we don't normally share with each other, and a way to inject some positive energy in the moment.
Thank you. And thank you, Gretchen, for taking it right to that level of what behaviors can we do in the workplace, right? We can have more informal chats in the hallway. We can start our meeting with a positive share or celebration. We could end a meeting with an inspirational quote. We did that for a while on our weekly meetings. Start with a positive share, end with an inspirational quote, and somebody would be prepared to come in with that. Have more gatherings, do social, stop and chat in the hallway, stop into someone's office and see how they're doing. So sort of like all the things that we know are good leadership practices, we have to step back and think which ones are more important than ever now, and we need to be more intentional about. So GP, I'd love to hear what you think about that particular question and the idea of thriving culture in today's environment. Oh, you're on mute.
Still doing this. I think a thriving, a healthy culture is a healthy culture in any environment. I was looking, as I was preparing for this, I bumped into an old quote from a humanistic psychology called Carl Rogers, who says, two conditions are required in order for a climate to be a growth promoting one, where each person can reach towards their full potential. The individual must be able to be their genuine self. And as the individual expresses their true self, they must be accepted by others. And for me, at the end of the day, we're all looking, in a time where everything is shaky, we look for home. A home, in a good day, is a place where we can experience belonging and freedom at the same time, where freedom doesn't come at the cost of belonging, or belonging doesn't come at the cost of freedom. And and in moments in which there's upheaval, then what we want to make sure that is that that we have friends, that there's people there who are going to care for, that there's care, that they're going to care for us, and also that we can still have faith that, and in non-religious and institutional terms, that the institution is still there and is still doing something good. And I think everything that Gretchen said, I feel like I don't want to repeat what she said, because it's so precise and it's so true that there's the element of, for me, there's 3 Ds of workplace despair, which is distraction, distress, and disconnection. And they map perfectly to what Gretchen was talking about. Focus to avoid distraction. This is the one thing we need to pay attention to. Reaching out, some kind of containment to avoid distress. Okay, I see that you're hurting, or what's happening, that's good. And then, let's gather. The one thing I would add is probably small rituals, because upheaval brings a sense of, lack of continuity, there's a lot of things that seem up in the air. And the knowledge that, okay, we have some rituals, whether it is those kind of, we have a team meeting, we have a small check-in, then we focus on what are we doing on the base of certain priorities, they can just be so orienting. And if you're interested, there's a piece I wrote a while back, which it got surprisingly amount of attention for what it was. And it was a piece that basically said, in moments of crisis, everyone says we need a leader with a vision. But when you actually ask people, what do you remember of someone who you think led very well a team you were part of in a crisis? What they describe is something that the psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called holding. It's not vision. It's not like we have some grand thing, but the ability to interpret and contain. This is what's happening, and this is what we're going to do about it. And this is how we are, and it's okay. And let's acknowledge it, but let's not be incapacitated by it. And holding is an environment, in which people slowly can recover their cognitive capacity and their emotional equanimity and then begin to act. Winnicott said that the outcome of holding, if you look at the child who's relatively comfortable at home, what do they want to do? They want to go out and play. And so that the outcome of good holding is actually the restoration of creativity and exploration and all of that. And what I've added to this in my research is that there's actually two kinds of holding we need. And Gretchen was talking about all these behaviors that make people feel held, the check-in. But there's also, I think, a part that is institutional. And I think for leaders, it's extremely important to make sure that we sense that you're not just caring for the people, but you're caring for the institution. The fact that you're sorry for me and you see my pain, but the reward system in the organization is unfair, doesn't make me feel very held. The fact that, we're all sitting here checking in, acknowledging each other's feeling, but we don't know whether the business is still going to exist in 5 years from now, doesn't make me feel very held. And I think sometimes those of us who are on the psychological side, we tend to over-index the interpersonal holding, and we don't focus enough on the necessity for structures, processes to be solid and fair so that people can have faith in the institution. And if you look at some stuff that happens in business, sometimes people work for and forgive leaders who are genuine A** holes. And they shouldn't forgive them. But why do they do that? Because they feel those leaders are looking after an institution that they benefit from. And therefore, they actually disregard the interpersonal because they feel you're taking care of an institution that takes care for me. So I would say, it's important to focus on that. And in moments of distress, as a leader, you might have to do some difficult things. Cut some programs, reduce budgets, not hire someone for a team that desperately need another person. And it's important for people to understand that those difficult things are acts of care. They're not acts of interpersonal care because that person really wanted that extra budget and you're saying no, but they're acts of institutional care. And I think sometimes a lot of disappointment in leadership in crisis is not because they don't show up interpersonally, but because they don't explain how some of the difficult institutional measures we are taking are actually acts of care. And therefore they come across as acts of neglect. And so I would say, yes, focus on giving people friends by doing all the good interpersonal holding, but also make sure people still have faith in the institution. And if you want to know what it means to have faith in the institution, it's not just to have faith that the institution can continue to keep the lights on through a revenue stream, but also that the institution is living up to the values you declare. That we continue to be who we say we are. Otherwise, it doesn't matter that you bring me in your office and you check in on my feelings and you say, oh, I must be in pain, and you feel my pain if you're not, if the institution is derailing.
So really, it's important to think about both of those, right? To not neglect the interpersonal and also make sure that the institutional care is also surfaced and talked about. It made me think of a time I was in a group of people who were complaining about the dean. This is one of the favorite pastimes in business schools, I think. But, one person piped up and said, you know what, you can say all that, but this person, this dean, is working so hard on behalf of the school. And it kind of like put everybody back on their heels a little bit because that was actually very true. So it's interesting.
I'll say one more little thing. It's not just that, it's just the fact that sometimes people feel great when they feel the sacrifices they're being asked to make are helping the institutions remain the one that they were proud to join and belong to. And so it's not just about you as a leader, but you as a leader inviting people to see that some of the hardships they are going through is actually has a meaning. It has to do with keeping the institution going.
Okay. Okay. Very good. So I want us to address one more question before we jump into our breakouts. And it really is a good follow on to what we were just talking about, which is help us with, thinking about our deeper purpose, the deeper purpose of management education, because in our work, we have the opportunity to impact not just our own teams and individuals, but also those an organization, but the individuals and the teams and the organizations of our clients. So what would you say about the role management education should be playing now, not just in developing leaders, but in shaping how organizations respond to these social, economic, and moral challenges and complexities? I even wonder sometimes, how might executive education play a role in helping people and factions become less polarized? Because that's one of the, big factors in the world today, it seems. So what should be our role in addressing all these challenges that we've talked about as management education providers? And GP, I know you do a lot of work on just learning and learning as a way to create great organizations and so on. So I'd like to start with you and then Gretchen, and then we'll go into our breakouts.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that management education in general, management education is certainly a place where lots of people go, as you said, to learn leadership. And I think we should take those brochures seriously, that we are producers of leadership, that we are producers of not just the people, but we're producers of the images, the stories, the practices that then people bring to work and beyond work. And I think one of the things we need to look very closely at is, are we making things better or are we making things worse? And I would say that sometimes we make things worse for reasons that have to do with our habits. So as you said, I've done some research on this, on the kind of strategic and social function of learning. And we looked at 70 different companies and their leaders of learning. And one of the things we noticed is we traditionally think of learning as a tool to foster alignment. And we invite people to kind of worship this idea of aligning on a single message and then delivering efficiently. It's the last religion we have, the religion of efficiency. And perhaps in doing that, we have created a side effect, which is cultures that are so aligned and efficient, they tend to be not so inclusive and innovative. And one of the things we looked at, my colleague Annie Peshkam here, is that there are three functions of learning in our society. And one is to generate coherence, adherence to a norm. But another one is to also generate dissonance, empowering people to challenge norms. And another one is to create connections between parties that wouldn't otherwise have connected. And we call these three kind of leaders the custodians, the challengers, and the connectors. And I think until we consider the custodian the default mode, and we don't pay enough attention to what extent is our work challenging the status quo, to what extent is our work helping people come together, to what extent do we make that a priority? And as you say, for me right now, the priority is really building pluralism without polarization, making sure that whole people can be members of relatively pluralistic institutions. Our priority cannot be making organizations more aligned and efficient. We've done that for 50 years too well, so well that we created problems that I think we now need to think about and address. And I think the mismatch between the learning needs and the kind of learning habits is probably one of the single most interesting, most challenging points of focus. But also, to be optimistic, it's a great point of intervention, because we actually have the instruments in our toolbox to really address that. If we had the courage to say that should be the outcome of management education. The outcome of management education shouldn't be knowledge or skills. That stuff you can do on YouTube. The outcome of management education should be growing closer. The fact that we are growing and that our relationships are becoming stronger.
Thank you. I think sometimes we underestimate the importance and the power of those relationships. So thank you for that. Gretchen, what are your thoughts?
So I'd like to magnify that second learning piece that GP just talked about. One of my colleagues here at Michigan is Bob Quinn, the author of Deep Change. And I think for us as executive education providers, that we can be trusted advisors to our clients. But being trusted advisors isn't being an echo chamber. It's challenging them to think in new ways. Amy Edmondson had a piece out a month or two ago in the Harvard Business Review about psychological safety is not making people feel comfortable. It's not about being nice. It's about creating a place where people can give honest feedback, where people can share difficult topics in a safe environment. I think what we need to do is create that kind of psychological safety to ask people, help people to dig deeper, to think outside the box. And Deep Change, Bob's work, I think, is really instrumental in helping people going back to the fundamentals of how do they want to make a contribution, what really needs to be done, but maybe that we're afraid to do, and helping people have the courage to make hard decisions and move their organizations in important new directions. So that's one. And then one other piece I will say that I think what we can do is help our clients build learning communities in their own organizations. So as leaders in these times of uncertainty, we don't have all the answers ourselves. Often the answers are in our people or in our customers. People who are on the front line can see things that we can't always see. So how do we build a kind of learning community to bring out that wisdom in the room? And so we have a few tools that we've developed at Michigan that really help bring out that wisdom in the room that maybe when we get to the final question, I can share a little bit more. But how do we really create that learning community where we're empowering all people in organizations to be part of the solution and not just be looking to those at the top to figure it out for them?